And joining us now on the line from New York, New York, Jagdish Bhagwati. He is professor of economics and law at Columbia University and senior fellow in international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Bhagwati, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be on your program again.
Thank you so much. There are, I don't have to tell you, considerable fears that the European Union is about to experience an economic meltdown in ways that we actually haven't seen in the past few years. Things seem to be under control for a bit, and now these fears have returned with a vengeance. How come?
You see the two types of problems, particularly in Greece, and Italy to some extent, exactly like that. They have a deficit, which is a flow deficit, meaning, like we have in their budget. That has to be closed because it cannot be continued without getting more and more money from outside. But also, particularly Greece, you have an debt overhang, like the Americans inherited from the George W. Bush era. So we've got two problems. One is a flow problem, and the other is a stock of debt. And these need two very different types of instruments and policy options. And I think the European community has been largely focused on getting the flow part really done by the Greeks. And the problem there is that in order to get them to tighten the belt, you really have to be able to persuade your country and the people to accept the austerity. Also, when you get the austerity, that in turn means that you get a downturn in the amount of economic activity, which then leads to less revenue in turn. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation.
I
think that is really at the heart of the problem, in my opinion.
I appreciate that, but let's follow up on Greece for a second. How much of it is either fiscal policy versus what we hear all the time, which is that the Greeks just don't like to pay their taxes?
Well, I mean, that's not paying taxes is part of your fiscal policy. The point is, by fiscal policy would mean the difference between what you take in and what you have to pay out. And I think that they've been extremely extravagant, as you know. I mean, they retired at ages at which we actually, mature like good wine. They just go off and, enjoy themselves. And I think this is the sort of thing where I think maybe under socialism, I'm a Democrat, so I don't like to, just go against socialism as such, but I think essentially they've been spending too much money. And I think this is also where the breakdown of the euro, or they're getting out of the euro, will not really help them, because it's like, if I'm spending too much at the local store, there's no way I can, just by fiddling, my exchange rate and so on, arrive at a balance. So even if they get out of the euro, they have to break even. They just can't continue spending as much as they did. So they have a real problem, but I think it is not the fact that they're part of the euro. It's the fact that they're spending too much, and somehow we've got to help them out. And that's what the fund is really about, the IMF is about, which is to ease the problem of adjustment. Because if you just have to go like shock therapy, immediately the whole thing breaks down politically. And so we really have to go ahead and have the IMF financing, which I think will have to be done increasingly to try and ease it. But they have to have a proper commitment to do it gracefully and on schedule. And I think that is where if you go too fast, and I think IMF always has given you that extra lifeline to be able to ease your way out of excess spending. And I think that's a good thing, and I think this is where they will put the bulk of their, the EU is going to be through Christine Lagarde, who is basically one of their people, a French woman. So you're going to get that. But at the same time, they also have to worry about the debt overhang. And there they've had, the question of the bailout, etc., comes in. And I think this is where I personally think that Mrs. Merkel is on the right track, in the sense that to give the banks and the bondholders a free pass, saying, we'll cover everything that that you don't have to take a haircut. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, hang on, let me follow up on this then. Let me follow up on this, because you mentioned the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and I want to find out how. Give me your view on how Germany suddenly became the Eurozone's paymaster in all of this. They've become sort of the bank of last resort. How did that happen?
Because no one else has the kind of money to bail out Greece and the the Mediterranean countries which are increasingly getting into trouble. Germany is in a very strong financial position, and I think that is what leads it to be the ultimate banker in the European situation.
And what happens if they
They've
stop?
been
What if they say we don't want to do this
and-
anymore?
No, but they won't do that. I think you see the point is Mrs. Merkel is right in the sense that supposing you go to your taxpayers and say we've got to bail out the Greeks who are spending too much or retiring very early, and you have to bail them out. You have to take care of their huge debt overhang. It's not a viable situation, and I think correctly so. On the other hand, if they start giving out monies, from the European Central Bank and so on, and generating funds that way, so as to prevent the banks from getting a haircut, then you have the problem that it could throw the entire financial system into a crisis. So I think we have to break it down into two steps. One is, you first have essentially the taxpayers help you out to begin with, but then you tax the banks which are not getting a haircut, and you put down a tax on them, collect the money, and then compensate the taxpayers. But you can't do it in one fell swoop. So you've got to break it down into two components, and I think that's the one they're moving into now.
Okay, I hear you on that, but then again, we hear a lot of stories about how fragile the European banking system is right now. Could they handle the kind of tax that you've just talked about?
Yeah, because I think they would pay the tax only insofar as they've got profits in the first place. I mean, they're in a fragile situation because of the haircut problem. But if the haircut is prevented by giving them taxpayer bailout, then you make sure that the financial system doesn't get into a massive upheaval. At the same time, you tax the banks in order to compensate the taxpayers. If you use one instrument to attack both problems, you're going to be in a mess. But if you decompose it into two instruments, which I think they're moving to, that makes sense. There's no way Germany can simply let the taxpayers do everything, because Mrs. Merkel will simply lose the elections on that.
Okay, a follow-up on the banking question. You remember, of course, a few years ago, the Americans decided to go for this TARP program, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, injecting a lot of money into banks in order to make sure that the banking system didn't collapse. Do you think something like that needs to be done in Europe?
I don't think they're in that particular kind of situation. They're not in the Lehman Brothers kind of situation right now. I think that between the ECB and the taxpayer, and then the German taxpayers basically providing the funds and doing it this sort of walking on two legs, as I was suggesting, that I think is manageable. And I think what they've had to come to terms with is, and I think this was true of us also for a long time, we thought the problem was manageable. I mean, that was a mistake of many of the advisors in Washington, that it takes time to understand how deep-seated a problem is, and there's always this hope which people have that somehow the problem will disappear with relatively small interventions. And I think by now the Europeans have realized that they just have to be massive in the approach they have to the problem. But I don't think the TARP program is anything which they really need right now. I mean, the TARP program did play a good role. In my opinion, the Americans were actually experimenting, and they've been ahead of the curve on some of these problems, because the crisis started in United States, and I was sort of optimistic that we would be able to handle it in the United States, because in the United States, basically it's a pragmatic culture, and faced with the problem after Lehman Brothers, and when they realized that the financial situation was just incredibly bad, they just decided to try one thing after another, and it became a pragmatic culture. If one plan doesn't work, then they move to plan 2, plan 3, plan 4, and this is why I was optimistic that they would never get into the tank. Europeans are a bit different, particularly on the French side, because as you remember, when the crisis happened, President Sarkozy was photographed reading Marx's Das Kapital. That's a very different approach to handling a crisis.
Well,
that's ideological.
Let me try playing a bit of a what-if game with you anyway, because I don't have to tell you there are many people out there who are speculating that the euro isn't going to survive, and that it would be perhaps advantageous in the end if everybody went back to their own respective currencies. Nouriel Roubini, your friend in New York City, thinks it's inevitable. Right. What would the implications be for the end of the euro and everybody going back to what they had before?
I don't see how it can happen, because breaking it down means reworking all the contracts in terms of individual currencies and so on. Even if you contemplate that for one country like Greece, it's not what we economists call sometimes in jargon transaction costs, of recontracting and work, rewriting the books and so on. That is enormous. And so it seems to me that that's one reason why it won't happen. And the second reason, of course, is it is a political experiment too. If you remember the reunification of Germany, when Kohl went ahead, despite all the economic advice, and went ahead with reunification and basically taking on East Germany and putting it on a par with West Germany. He knew that it was going to be an enormous expenditure, but that was a political decision. And frankly, do you see the Europeans going into a meltdown like that? No, they will come up with whatever money they need to for bailouts or whatever they need to do that. So I think it is really, Nouriel, I think basically prospers on pessimism.
Well, they call him Dr. Doom for a reason, and he's been right almost all the time over the last 3 years, right?
Well, not almost all. Well, I think when he's he's an optimist, he's called Dr. Gloom, and when he's a pessimist, he's called Dr. Doom.
Okay, let me get. That's not a bad
line. Those are the only two options that Nouriel has, I think. And I think he hit pay dirt one time, but you're right. I don't think on this one. I think he's really. I mean, this is too much to expect. If you say, look, will there be another crisis like in the United States right now? A double dip, another recession. There, I would be inclined to say, yes, that's a 50-50 prospect right now. But breakdown of the euro, that's a gigantic political assumption underlying that forecast, and I just don't think Europeans will do that.
True enough. We've got about 30 seconds left here, Dr. Bhagwati. Let me put one more thing to you, which is until recently, I think there was a belief that emerging markets, Brazil, India, China, for example, would help lead the world to, if not spectacular, at least decent economic recovery. Do Europe's troubles, and as deep as they are, mean that those BRIC countries can no longer save us all, so to speak?
No, I think because even now, with all the with the U.S. being in trouble, with the EU being increasingly more in trouble, India has still been growing at around 7.5. China is also in the same league. Brazil has been growing too, not in the same not at the same rate, but so they're all very positive, decent or indecently large growth rates. And I think that engine is not going to disappear at all. And I think it will still be the locomotive that drives the economy. But I think in the end, we have to generate our own growth endogenously, from within our own system. And I think that's where President Obama's speech tonight is going to be very critical, because if he can somehow manage to put in more stimulus expenditure and develop a meaningful scenario, that is really what we really need. After all, how much can we rely on exports, for example? Because our exports are somebody else's imports. If the president says we are going to export more,
someone's got to buy
them. The other guys are going to say.
We got it. Dr. Bhagwati, I got to jump in there because that's our time tonight. Thank you so much for joining us from the Council on Foreign Relations and Columbia University via New York City. We appreciate your time.